Hello, and thanks for joining us. Coming up on today's film show.
Sir James Martin. Vastly rich, rather simple.
How jolly. Tiny green balls. What are they called?
Peas.
Love, friendship, and plenty of quips. Whit Stillman's new film reunites Kate Beckinsale and Chloe Sevigny in an adaptation of Jane Austen's acerbic novella, Lady Susan. Whit's with us in the studio to tell us more.
Church and hill.
I'm joined by our film critic Lisa Nesselson. Hello.
Hello.
And Whit, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, before we get on to Love and Friendship, your latest film, it's worth reminding viewers that your first film, Metropolitan, was a low-budget hit in 1990. Whit then went on to make Barcelona, Last Days of Disco, and more recently, Damsels in Distress. This film, Love and Friendship, in this film you examine certain social codes, quite a closed milieu, that's the upper classes. What makes them a good subject?
Well, it's really seen through Jane Austen's eyes, and this is something she wrote very young, and it's very funny. It's before she became more sententious and romantic, and so this is the funny Jane Austen.
There's certainly plenty of funny dialogue. Let's take a look at the friendship at the centre of this film between Lady Susan and Alicia Johnson.
I had a feeling that the great word respectable would someday divide us. Your husband I abhor, but we must yield to necessity. Our affection cannot be impaired by it, and in happier times, when your situation is as independent as mine, we will again unite. For this, I will impatiently wait.
I also.
May Mr. Johnson's next gouty attack end more favourably.
Now, some people, let's call them bottomlessly ignorant, would be in the mood to say that your work is too talky. What is your rebuttal to someone who would dare to say that we need less talk and more cinema?
Well, I think the way you really know people is through what they say and how they say it. So if you deprived characters of that, I think you wouldn't be left with very much. And there's a tradition, I think, in the 1930s of making very good films that were very fast-paced and very talky, and people didn't mind it at all. I think it's just all the bad talk that's given dialogue a better reputation.
Now, people in Austen's era spent a lot of time composing letters or sitting around waiting for a written reply. What do you think Miss Austen would have made of email and, say, Twitter?
Well, since I identify entirely with Jane Austen, I think she would like them very much. I find Twitter and email great innovations because I don't like talking on the phone.
Well, let's get a taste of Lady Susan's very personal notion of good manners.
Forgive me. Forgiven. The fallacy of youth. Isn't it rather clear that it is we, women of decision, who hold the trumps?
Lady Susan. Lady Susan Vernon.
How dare you address me, sir?
But Lady Susan.
Be gone, sir. I will have you whipped.
Outrageous. Have you never met him?
No, I know him well. I would never speak to a stranger like that.
As we can see from that extract, the women in this film are quite clever, cunning, and certainly in control of their own lives, to a certain extent. And the men are amiable and perhaps less than intelligent. Do you think women were really calling the shots in the 19th century?
Well, that's one of the sort of problems I have with contemporary feminism, the implication that women in the past were total incompetents and victims, when I think a lot of them were dominating the world quite well. The expression cherchez la femme was, of course, indicating that behind many events was the woman.
And what about the female characters in Lady Susan? I mean, how did you create this very three-dimensional lady at the centre of this film?
Well, Lady Susan Vernon is purely a creation of Jane Austen. So our film is sort of 2/3 the Jane Austen original and 1/3 added. And I must admit, a lot of the sort of screen time for Foolish Men was part of the added part. Because in an epistolary novel, characters don't really exist if they don't write the letters. So Sir James Martin is described in the letters, but he doesn't write letters himself, and perhaps he couldn't write letters himself. So that was left to an actor, Tom Bennett, to sort of fill out the part, and he's made a big hit of the interpretation he did. It's so funny.
Now, obviously, you said you identify with Jane Austen. If a space alien approached you and said, They'd like to know whether reading Jane Austen would give them all the insight they need or a great deal of insight into these earthlings wandering around. What would you tell them?
I would say yes, but they shouldn't start with the first novel I started with. I started with her parody or send-up of Gothic novels, Northanger Abbey. I was 18, I didn't know what to make of it, and I went around loudly telling people that Jane Austen was overrated and very bad. And fortunately, 5 years later, I read Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. So I would give the space alien Persuasion, Mansfield Park, or Pride and Prejudice.
Which is your favourite of them all?
I like those three.
Those
are my three favorites.
Can't choose.
But I think my first of the ones I liked was Sense and Sensibility, and I think that's a good door of entry because it's quite sort of journalistic and schematic. It's the sort of good, sensible girl and the romantic girl who's very foolish.
Well, they say it's almost a documentary evidence of life in those circles at the time. Now, the 19th century England of Jane Austen's time, that country was not part of the European Union. It is now, but it's currently reviewing that situation. We asked filmmaker Stephen Frears what he thought about the UK's place in the EU.
You know, I mean, quite consciously you make films and they're shown around. It first happened with My Beautiful Laundrette, which suddenly was playing in Barcelona and Germany, I mean all around the world. And you think, well, that's very odd. And then I've slowly realized that that's essential. In other words, you make films for export. And that's because Britain has become a multicultural country. So we've become sort of European. You know, when the people in Brexit say, give us back our country, it wasn't a very interesting country, and it wasn't very interesting, it wasn't very stimulating, and it wasn't very advanced. You know, I know what Britain was like after the war. I wouldn't want anybody to live through that.
Now, watching the film Love and Friendship, as a British person, I really got the impression that you have a great affection for and understanding of British society. But when making your films, do you think about, as Stephen Frears mentioned, this export market?
It's more the import market in a sense. So we actually shot the film in and around Dublin, which turns out to be the ideal spot to shoot a English set 18th century film. But it's still very 18th century and a sort of beautiful version of the 18th century. And our film was a co-production between Ireland, France, the Netherlands, and implicitly the United States, because that's where I'm from. And so I see it as more of an import thing. So we made this extremely English film entirely outside England, although the sort of brains and talent of it comes from London because the casting was done there. The brilliant actors and comedians who were in the film, Stephen Fry, Tom Bennett, Justin Edwards, they are from London, and they make the film very British.
Now, you've lived in Europe on and off for much of your adult life. Would you say that Paris is a better place to create?
I don't think you can say that. Paris is the loveliest of big cities to live in, and it is a very nice place to write. It has the pace of writing, but I think there's so many other good places to write in the United States or abroad.
Now, at the centre of this film, Love and Friendship, there is a very strong friendship between the characters played by Chloe Sevigny and Kate Beckinsale. Do you think in the film, and perhaps in the novel, what wins out in the end, love or friendship?
Well, I don't think it has to be opposed, so I think both are so important. Our film is much more about friendship than love, really. I think that in this case, it was a better collaboration between Chloe Sevigny and Kate Beckinsale, a happier collaboration, because it's much more fun watching two friends, even if they're doing malicious things, plot together and laugh together, than to have one friend constantly undermining the other, which is this part of Last Days of Disco.
That's true.
So I think people enjoy that more.
It's very friendly. Well, Love and Friendship is one of the films you can catch at the Fête du Cinéma, which is starting here on Sunday in Paris, where people in France can see a whole range of films. Lisa, tell us how that works.
Well, this is an amazing initiative. There were no movie theaters in France when Jane Austen was alive, and today there are 5,600 screens. So to encourage people to sort of rev up their movie-going metabolism, buy a ticket and go into some of them, each year in late June, the nation celebrates La Fête du Cinéma, which I guess we could translate as the big movie party. So during 4 days, from Sunday, June 26th through Wednesday, June 29th, it will cost less than half price, only €4. €4. That's about $4.50 to see any movie you please in any one of those movie theaters. Put simply, it's an amazing bargain. This is the 32nd edition, and millions upon millions of people take advantage of it. What's great about it is that you don't have to see something that's just coming out. You can catch up with that thing that's been playing for years you've been meaning to see. You can see a restored classic. You can see any movie your heart desires. Some people rail about big government and central planning, but one thing that's brilliant is that after World War II, the CNC took charge of all cinema going in France. And so it's relatively easy to pull off an initiative like this. The National Federation of French Cinemas is all for it, and you can always, always trust French box office figures because they literally count every single movie ticket that somebody obtains at any point in any day in France.
So that's a great plan then if the not very summery weather continues. Lisa, thank you for joining us today, and Whit, thanks for being our guest. We'll leave you with an extract of Love and Friendship. Remember, you can check out our website. We're also on Twitter and Facebook. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.
Madam, agonies, my dear.
What's happened?
The worst. Disaster.
Disaster?
Mr. de Courcy arrived just when he shouldn't have. Lucy Mannering had just forced herself into Mr. Johnson's study to sob her woes.
Oh, has she no pride? No self-respect?
What an impression she makes. Bursting from Mr. Johnson's library, wailing like a struck child. But seeing the letter in your handwriting, she tore it from Reginald to read aloud.
No.
Yes. Mannering comes this very hour.
And Reginald heard that?
He read it himself.
How ungentlemanly.